Okay, we're going to run through a quick presentation here on Reconstruction from start to finish. The goal is not to get every single detail about everything related to Reconstruction, more so just to get a general idea as to how it flowed throughout the years so that you can do a little bit more research on it on your own. Our target for this is to identify the achievements and shortcomings of the Reconstruction period, and we're going to bump ahead here. Let's see, a couple slides. Let's go a little bit further ahead, and there we go. So, let's start with presidential Reconstruction. We're looking at 1863 to 1866. Those years implying a couple things. First off, it starts before the end of the Civil War. Because if you notice here, when we're talking about 1863, the war ended in what year? 1865. Another thing that I want you to notice is that because it ends in 1866, we're going to be looking at two separate presidents because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. So let's get started looking at what Lincoln had planned out prior to his assassination and what he actually was able to accomplish. He did have Reconstruction well planned, and his goal was to be pretty lenient with the South. As we have spoken about many times, Lincoln's #1 goal was rejoining the country. And in his opinion, it was best to rejoin the country quickly, peacefully, in whatever way possible. So his plan was pretty lenient. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get much of his plan passed, which was known as the 10% plan, if you recall back to some of the discussion about the Oath of Loyalties. But unfortunately, his plan wasn't really able to be used because he was assassinated too early. One thing he was able to get accomplished was in in 1863-1864, he created the Freedmen's Bureau, which was designed to help provide supports for African Americans who were recently freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. And later on, they would also be helped if they were freed from the 13th Amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau was really the only lasting piece of Lincoln's Reconstruction plans that had much of an impact because he was assassinated. So, with Lincoln out of the picture, Andrew Johnson became our next president. Andrew Johnson was much less strict than people expected. The one positive from his time in office was that the 13th Amendment was passed around the country, which abolished slavery. And when we say the word abolished, we are talking about ending, getting rid of, doing away with. So it's gone. Slavery in no location is allowed anymore. I'm going to do this just so I can get rid of that line. There we go. Continuing on here, there were some problems though, and it's going to cause a lot of tension between Andrew Johnson and the Congress at the time. Because if you remember, and this is going back to government, that's something that you need to think about, in order for laws to get passed, it's best to have both the President and the Congress on the same page. Now, you can still pass laws without the President, but you can't really do that without Congress. You could have executive orders. We're not going to get into that. But if the Congress has a super majority, they're able to pass things on their own, but it's not very likely that's going to happen. It actually did happen at this period of time in history, and we'll talk about why right now. One thing that the Congress got upset with Andrew Johnson about is that he was super easygoing and lenient about a lot of things, even more so than Lincoln would have been. In particular, he wasn't concerned with helping out African Americans. Now, the first problem that's listed on here says that former Confederates were being elected to office. In other words, whenever the war ended, the Confederate states in the South, in many cases, just kept the same governments in place, and many Northerners didn't like that, and they thought that they should be punished for the war and for seceding in the first place, and they shouldn't be able to keep their place. Nonetheless, that causes some issues with the Congress. A second issue was that in the South there were a lot of cases of African Americans being mistreated, in things known as black codes in specific. Now keep in mind, at this time period, the word black, colored, or Negro would have been commonly used to describe what the group of people that today we would refer to as African Americans, just so you understand that it's not me being rude and politically incorrect. It's more so just about trying to put this into context of what they actually were called, because they were called black codes at the time period. But black codes would say things like people who are of black skin are not allowed to own guns, serve on juries, vote, a lot of things that were basic rights of the white Americans that were being taken away from the former slaves. Johnson was letting these things slide, and it made Congress extremely upset. And they wanted to take over, which brings us to 1866. And 1866 was a congressional election year. And just so you know, every 4 years we vote on president, and we also vote for our Congress or I should say some positions of Congress, all the members of the House, and then some members of Senate. Well, every 2 years, the off years from the presidential election, we still have congressional elections in which the House of Representatives turns over, as well as some of the members of the Senate. So in this election year, there were some big issues going on related to the treatment of African Americans. In specific, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was proposed, and its goal was to provide equal protection laws for African Americans. They called it the Equal Protection Clause. Now, while it was intended to be to protect African Americans, it actually helps all different people. The wording of the 14th Amendment says that you can't provide people with different treatment based upon their gender, their race, ethnicity, their religion, their age, all kinds of different things. And the reason I'm emphasizing this right now is because the 14th Amendment is something that will come up again in history and again and again and again, and I'm sure you'll see it in your lifetime very soon even, because it's constantly referred to with many different laws as providing equal treatment and equal protection of the laws. Basically, what they wanted to make sure of was that if there was a case in which a person who was white committed a crime and a person who was African American committed a crime, they got equal treatment of the laws because it wasn't occurring in the South. And in reality, even with the 14th Amendment in the South, it still doesn't actually play out that way in the late 1800s. So just so you understand how that was designed to work. Now, the Congress, they were for the 14th Amendment being passed in all the states. Andrew Johnson was against it. It's not to say that he didn't like it at all. It's more so that he just didn't think it was necessary. And he said some things like, whatever, they'll be fine. They don't need this. They have enough rights, all of those types of things. And in the meantime, in months leading into this election, there were 34 African Americans who were killed by mobs in Louisiana. These are called lynchings. And on a national scale, this made Andrew Johnson look extremely bad because people were saying, oh yeah, you're going to say it doesn't matter, and then you've got 34 people being murdered and nothing's happening because of it. What ended up happening, though, is in the election of 1866, the Congressional election, the Republicans who were in Congress gained a supermajority, and it's really going to allow them to overpower Andrew Johnson. If you remember correctly, a 2/3 majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate overpowers a president's veto. So what ends up happening from here on out is that Andrew Johnson has almost no power, and it's not a very good presidency. If you want to look up his impeachment, it's kind of interesting. Which brings us to Congress's version of Reconstruction, which is known as Congressional Military Reconstruction, which starts in 1867, which is when that majority that they won in 1866 actually takes effect. So Congress now overpowered the president, and what they decided to do was kick out all the governments that refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. This was all of the southern states except, or I should say all the Confederate states except for Tennessee. In order for them to be readmitted into the Union, they were required to ratify the 14th Amendment, which we already discussed, which was equal treatment of the laws, regardless of race, gender, anything else. And they also were required to grant suffrage to African Americans. This word right here, suffrage, is a word that you're going to need to learn in the future as well. All that it means is the right to vote. So the right to vote for African Americans, which was the 15th Amendment. Something interesting, just as a side note, African American men were given the right to vote before white women gained the right to vote. Kind of interesting to look at our history with that, because white women were not given the right to vote, or any women, I really should say, until the 1900s. So we're looking at the 1920s, really. What ends up happening here is this puts the Republicans in super control of Congress. The reason being is, when you give African Americans this right to vote, they're going to vote, and they're not going to vote for the Southern Democrats that previously were winning. They're going to vote more for these Republicans. So this is kind of like a self-serving type of situation that we have occurring here, even though it's the right thing to do, I would say, in allowing African Americans the right to vote. It is a little bit self-serving in that it helps the North because they're going to have more allies in the South now in the Congress. These are the military districts that were formed. Actually, William Sherman was a military leader over one of these districts. And basically the point was that until they decided to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments, these states were not allowed back into the Union and not allowed to have their own government. So they had to follow those rules, or else they really couldn't take part. Now, some more congressional changes are going to be coming up here soon. Some of these include the fact that we have a lot of how should we word this? We have a lot of different politicians in the South than we previously did. Previously, there were a lot of white Democrats. Now, we're still going to have a lot of white people running for office, but some of them are going to be Republicans, and some of them are going to be moving from the North down to the South, trying to gain power down here. The first group, a scalawag, was a white Southern Republican. In other words, it was somebody who was from the South, but who was more in favor of Northern policies. People didn't like that. They didn't like them favoring the enemy, per se. Carpetbaggers were Northern Republicans who moved down south in hopes of getting election and also in hopes of electing Republicans into office. And then the third one, African Americans were gaining power in the House of Representatives in particular. And this is something that causes a lot of problems with a lot of Southerners because they're saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Not only do these African Americans have the right to vote, now they're actually running for office and they're going to have some power over me. It made many Southerners extremely upset and definitely caused a lot of tension in the South. And a lot of these people from the South now, they started trying to regain their white supremacy. Notice it is in quotes. It was the belief that a lot of these people in the South are saying white people are better, and they wanted, literally they're better, like genetically, whatever else. And they're going to try to maintain that supremacy in government in any way possible, which leads us to some bad things. And we're going to see a rise in conservatives. Now, when we talk about conservatives in this context, it is not the same as conservatives today. Because today we would say if somebody's more liberal or more conservative, and it doesn't mean the same thing at all, really. Conservatives at this time period were looking at white Southern Democrats who were angry at what was going on, angry at the fact that African Americans gained the right to vote, they were gaining positions in office. A quote that aligns with this is a white man's country and white men must govern it. That was the sentiment and the feeling of a lot of people in the South, and they decided they would do whatever it took. So that means violence, intimidation, and they even got organized into groups like the Ku Klux Klan. I don't know how many of you have heard of them, but pretty famous group. They had a couple different times in which they were powerful, one now and also one will be in the 19-teens. The Ku Klux Klan was a social club that turned into a political group, and their goal was basically white supremacy. They wanted to keep Republicans and African Americans from gaining power. They were successful for a few years, but eventually Congress is going to limit this violence, and it's going to really limit their power. What ends up happening is Reconstruction as a whole comes to an end here in 1877. In the 1870s, radical Republicans lost their power in Congress because people flat out were tired of trying to fix the South. It was taking a long time. There's so many disagreements and struggles, and in complete honesty, people's focus kind of switched. Just like how in the news, there'll be one story that everybody focuses on so much, and then something else happens, then it takes over. It's like we discussed before with different tragedies. We switch from one to the next, and we forget about the previous ones. A lot of people are forgetting about the tragedy of slavery and all of the struggles that a lot of these African Americans were going through because, well, industry was taking over, and people were more interested in focusing on building a booming economy in America, and that's becoming more powerful. So the whole Reconstruction thing kind of fell apart. Ulysses S. Grant was president after Andrew Johnson, and his presidency wasn't that great either. There were a lot of questionable things going on. There was a lot of corruption, and a lot of the Northerners basically just flat out lost trust in the government and in Grant, and this causes some issues too, which leads us to the end of Reconstruction. The election of 1876 was another contested or disputed election. It was Rutherford B. Hayes against Samuel Tilden, and in this, Rutherford B. Hayes promised Congress that he would put an end to Reconstruction if he was elected and selected. By the way, what I'm saying when this is contested, just to kind of clarify this, neither one of these guys got a majority of the votes. Remember, you need more than 50%. Neither of them had more than 50%, therefore it goes to the Congress to decide. Hayes told Congress, I'll get rid of Reconstruction if you elect me. They like that idea. He gets elected. And, well, he ends Reconstruction. So the South was able to regain their control over everything that was really going on in the South. And this leads to a lot of Jim Crow laws and such, which we will talk about later. And that's actually a super good search term, Jim Crow laws, for the future. Now, what are some positives and negatives of this time period? Well, positives are slavery ended and African Americans were legally equal with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The economy also made some improvements, and industry really was going very well. The negatives, racism and discrimination never went away, and those are some major problems that people are going to have to deal with. The whole white supremacy thing is going to be lasting for a long time. Think back to the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech was given in 1963. Almost 100 years after the Civil War, so you can tell that there still are a lot of problems that we're going to have that are ongoing. Poverty still is in the South in many regions. The economy was not completely fixed there. It's more like the northern and industrial economy is really strong. And basically Reconstruction was kind of unfinished. So when we look at it, industry takes over, and that becomes the big focal point of this. Now, if you want, there are a couple questions here that you can answer to kind of go through and make sure that you have understood this. But that's the end of this lesson. Make sure you take the quiz, and make sure you do have these big ideas and understand what the positives and negatives of Reconstruction were, because that's an important idea. All right, good job.